Hi, everyone. Can everyone hear me okay? If you can send a thumbs up or some signal, a text in the chat. You guys good? Okay, awesome. Hello, friends. It looks like there's a couple more. I'm just going to give a minute or two for more people to come in. Beautiful. Good evening, everyone. Thank you guys so much for joining us today. This is a labor of love that we have been doing in collaboration with Academia Montessori. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Susie. I am the founder of RIDE. RIDE is basically an organization that was started to help parents of children with developmental disabilities and or learning differences advocate for their children. And it very quickly evolved into something so much more that has now kind of brought us into the educational space. We have been collaborating now with the school for, I would say it's about 2 years now. And we were with the previous owner, and we have the pleasure now of working with Miss Janice and the team she has together now. So we've put together a series of parent webinars for you guys. The first one we will be talking about today is on developmental milestones. I want to preface this by saying it's a lot of information. We felt that it was super, super important to keep it all in there. So I want to just give you the disclaimer. It's going to be a lot to take in. We are going to try and focus on the things that we feel are most important to highlight to you guys. But what we will do is we will make this presentation available to you guys along with some other resources. And then obviously, if you have any questions or anything like that, you can always reach out to Miss Janice or reach out to us, and we'll be more than happy to answer any of those questions, or if you need any help or resources, provide you with assistance obtaining those resources. We will try and make some time at the end for a Q&A session, but if you guys have any questions that come up as we're going through the presentation, if you could do us a huge favor, and for those of you that are on the computer and can type your question out, if you could put it into the chat, what we'll do is we'll start monitoring those and we will address those during the Q&A session. If for whatever reason we can't get to it, we will provide you guys with a copy of all the questions that were asked, all of the answers, and we will make sure that is accessible to you guys as well. So let's go ahead and get started. I'm going to go ahead and start sharing the presentation here. Just a second. There we go. Can you guys see my screen? Okay. So like I said, today's presentation is on developmental milestones. We titled it Building Blocks, A Parent's Guide to Developmental Milestones. I'm trying to maximize the screen here. In just a second. There we go. And my team is actually here with me. I have Jessica Orozco Barajas, who is an LMFT. She will be taking the lead on this presentation. She is also our advocacy director. Dr. Veri Chavarin is also here. She heads our educational initiatives, and she's kind of like the one who's spearheading all of our educational collaboration with Academia Montessori. So we will kind of be here helping Jessica, maybe chiming in along the way, but this is your girl here. I'm going to let Jessica introduce herself and just take it away.
Okay, so hello everyone. My name is Jessica, and I am a licensed clinician and can one for about 15 years now. I specialized in the 0 to 5 population for several years. I worked at Children's for over a decade, and I have 2 children that are on the spectrum and ADHD. I kind of live in a neurodivergent household, and it's a lot of fun, a little chaotic. But, you know, I think I have the unique perspective of coming and sharing stuff with you from both a provider's lens and then also from, you know, personal experience. So with that, One of the things that I usually do when I have clients or when I come in and do private assessments for little ones is I always like to go over, right, to get a thorough history of milestones and where, developmental history and stuff like that. Because, I think oftentimes, I know I've said it, I've heard a lot of people say it, like, I wish kids came with manuals, and they don't, but this is kind of the closest thing that you're going to have, right, to a manual in terms of knowing more or less what your child should, right, shouldn't be doing at this age, what is in maybe an unrealistic expectations, because as parents, we all have them, we'll be honest. And then also, what are some of the red flags that you want to like pay attention to and not dismiss when it comes to your child's development, because it could be potentially indicative, right, of a delay of some sort, right, something that could be treated pretty easily, right, with like a round of early intervention, or something that's more pervasive, right, like autism or something along those lines. So with that, we'll jump in. And like I said, there's a ton of information. So I'll do my best to kind of get through and give you like the highlights. Susie will also, I get like read through like the chats and stuff, but more than anything, I think we'll go give you like a general kind of perspective of what the milestones are, just so that right, when we're talking about flags, like how those things connect and like what it is that you can look for. And usually it's like 3 or 4 big things, right, within each category that we're looking at that can also be pretty indicative of like, okay, my child's on the right track, right? Like, oh no, this is something that I have to follow more closely. So with all of that, right, hopefully you get a better understanding, and hopefully we kind of pique your interest into, right, learning more about why this is so crucial, right, in just parenting, understanding your child's behavior, all of that good stuff. Good. All righty, so outcomes, right? So know and distinguish the types of developmental milestones. One of the things that we are going to be looking at are going to be common challenges versus like red flags. And so basically, common challenges are things that we're going to see in a lot of children that are in that age group or age range. And then the red flags are, okay, now we're kind of rearing into the territory of, I should talk to my doctor about this. I should, perhaps seek additional consultation or a second opinion about whether or not my child is going to perhaps need some intervention. Yes, good. And hopefully we get to this part, right, where we talk about resources available to you in the event that you do want to kind of look for further assessment. Okay. Oh, that was a mouthful. Okay. So when we're talking about development, right, we need to look at it in a way where there's a lot of variability, right? And so what we're giving you is kind of like a window, more or less. So you'll see like between 0 and 6 months, more or less, right, your child should be doing this. Or if, right, like they're at, a year and this is not happening, right, then maybe this is more cause for concern. Sometimes we might have like a small deviation from like what your traditional trajectory of development is. And again, right, nothing that early intervention can't like help. Other times we have like complete like detours, right? And that's kind of those things that we're going to be looking at. But very rarely is it like, oh, everybody's hitting the milestones at exactly this time. So there is variability. And so I want you to keep that in mind, right? So if your child is like 3 months and we're talking about something, right, that happens like at 4, or, they're almost there, you're like, oh, I'm not seeing this emerge. Should I be panicked? Likely not, right? But again, this is why we have that window. And we're also going to be talking about, right, some temporary versus like persistent delays. A good example of that, and this is something that I think we shared with staff, was that, for example, children that grow up bilingual, so fully bilingual homes, right from the moment that they're born, tend to sometimes display delay in expressive speech, right, of up to like 6 months in comparison to like their monolingual kind of peers. Now, it doesn't stay. Once, and that doesn't mean that their language isn't developing. If anything, once their language, right, like is like comes on board, it's good in both areas, right? So they're fully bilingual, they can understand and all of that good stuff. And so I say that because sometimes we're like, what's an example of like a temporary thing that, will go away? That could be one of those things, right? Where it's not persistent, it's not pervasive, right? It's just something that we see and then it tends to like go away. And then all of a sudden your kids are fully bilingual. So that's kind of an example of a temporary one versus something that we might see like an autism or seizures or something like that later on the line. Okay. Am I going too fast or is it okay? No, good. Okay. So these are the different domains in development that we're going to be looking at. So we have cognitive, right, which has to do with the way that learn, process information, imagination, creativity, because yes, all of that, right, has to do with your cognitive functioning abilities, problem solving, reasoning, right, memory. Then we get fancier into working memory and all of these other things. But in general, this is what we're talking about, where we're talking about like cognitive kind of development. Language. Language is a really big marker. A lot of times kids that initially get seen for a delay will be because of a delay in language. And, if we're really on it, you guys can get in as early as like a year, year and a half. Other times people don't really get intervention until their kids are like already in preschool because like somebody on staff is noticing, right, that maybe they're not speaking in phrases or something like that. And so it's really important. But usually this is the first round, this is the first clue, right, that we might be seeing a delay in a child. So something to kind of keep in mind. And this isn't just in the way that they communicate, right? Because there's different types of language. So we have expressive speech and then receptive speech, or language, if you want to call it. Sometimes kids understand what's happening, so they can respond to directions and instructions. That's all there, right? It might be an expressive delay, right? Which means maybe they're not able to kind of completely verbalize what it is. And so there's different types of things. So we have to kind of keep all of these things. Now, another example that we might come across is a child might not have an expressive delay. They might have all these words, but if all they're doing is imitating, right, that's not functional language. It's not functional communication. And so, in the therapy world, if you will, or the assessment world, we wouldn't consider that, right? Somebody who's up to par with their peers in terms of their development for speech. Physical, this is, we have fine motor, gross motor, like just coordination, balance. Yeah, some people can be a little clumsier than others. Sometimes that can be indicative, right, of just spatial reason of those kinds of issues. And we'll discuss those in a bit. But yeah, whether or not your child can maybe like hold a pencil, right? We call it like a pencil grip, or like pick up Cheerios and things like that, right? By the age of like 12 months. If we're not seeing those things, right, we might need to work with them on some stuff. And then finally, social emotional. This is really big. This is actually one of the areas that we look at most when we're talking about potentially assessing and screening for autism, right? The biggest kind of area that takes a hit for people that are on the spectrum is the social emotional component. Now, some kids can make friends, but they can't keep them, right? Usually it's characterized, right, a little bit by extremes. So sometimes they just want to be left alone, and it's alone, but not lonely, right? So they're totally, completely, totally fine with playing alone, solitude, and they might even engage in behaviors of like getaway, right, kind of escape avoidance if that's kind of their preference. You have other kids that are maybe a little bit intrusive, right, which can be misconstrued for like aggressiveness. And so we want to make sure that we take into account all of those things, because those tend to fall into, right, like social emotional development, how they perceive themselves, right, perspective taking, and all of that good stuff. Good. Yes. Anything you ladies want to add or think that I'm glossing over too quickly?
No, I think we're good. I just have, if I could do like a really quick, if it's possible, poll, if you guys would mind typing in on the chat what age range you are, like what you're here for. Is your child, 6 months old, 4 years old, just so we can kind of get an idea of what, the group
Mhm.
is at. That would be awesome. So I could see that, and then we can keep going.
So it seems like a lot of 2-year-olds.
Yep.
1 and 3, okay. 3-ish, 3. It's a lot
Yeah,
of
we have a
toddlers.
lot of toddlers.
Yes. Okay.
Awesome. Okay. that kind of helps inform the pace at which we're gonna go. Thank you guys. Perfect. 2, almost 3, 1 and 3. Okay, so we have a 1-year-old, a 5. Awesome.
All right, so
Perfect. Okay.
yeah, I know that, and that's good because then, there's some things that we can focus a little bit more on. Again, all of this stuff, you'll have a nice takeaway, in terms of like a PDF, so that you can work on. But milestones. So now we'll look at babies and we'll kind of go a little more quickly through it, just because, population is our toddlers, but physical development, things that we are kind of looking for, right? It's just those reflexes, right? Hand to mouth. Are they able to kind of like focus on certain objects? Usually by 2 months, you're going to hear some cooing, not babbling yet, but you will hear some cooing. They should be able to kind of lift their heads. I think by 4 months, they're like kind of like doing this type of a thing, right? And so these are kinds of things that you want to pay attention to. They can kind of sit okay, right, by like the 6-month mark, and you'll see like teething kind of like happening around this time. Yeah, they explore the world a lot, right, like with their mouth, and so you always want to be careful with their ability, because by 6 months they're able to kind of they're beginning to master, right, the putting the things like in their mouths, if you will. Cognitive stuff, right? Now they're crying to kind of have their needs met, right? And again, remember, this is the marker between like 0 and 6 months, so it may not necessarily be like immediately, but they do recognize familiar voices and faces. I always say, be mindful of either kids that consistently look away and don't tend to gravitate to like people's faces. That can be a very, very early indicator, right, of potential like autism down the line. Not, of course, it's not a guarantee, but those are some of the things that we begin to look at very, very early on. Another thing that we want for them to kind of do is now they're babbling more, and they're able to like just kind of follow things like with their eyes. And so those are like those markers of things that we would like for them to kind of do by that time period. Okay. Language development, response to speech by looking to the speaker, right? And so if your child isn't kind of like orienting to like sound, that's a good, right? Like you definitely want to talk to your doctor about that, because hearing might be an issue, which can then later impact speech. And sometimes, we want to kind of eliminate these things like as soon as we like catch on, only because that can also be flagged potentially for like autism, even though it's an entirely different, right, issue altogether. Good. All righty. Now we have, right, the social emotional development. They like like the mama, like the cooing, that kind of like that pitch that we use, like, oh, that type of thing. They like it. We encourage you to use words and not made up stuff, just because they can still learn language through that. But yes, there is something about, right, like that, like I think they call it mamaese or something like that, way in which we speak to like babies. They do like that. They smile spontaneously, and they do like to be played with and picked up. And so those are things that we're starting to see now in terms of the realm of how they're interacting, right, with their caregivers. So just because a child doesn't speak, or, a lot of times people are like, oh, they just kind of like don't do a whole lot. They're doing stuff, right? And these are those early indications of things, right? Like, so if you talk to them, right, this is when they smile, or they kind of like, they have these mirror neurons. So they're looking, and sometimes they're imitating when you round your eyes and things like that, right? So those are like, sometimes not super noticeable, but things that you want to catch your baby doing. Questions? We good? Moving on. Okay. So now we're going to go into, right, like the latter part of that first year. And so again, they're able to sit completely now without support. They should be able to crawl around. Now, I will say that in terms of research, they would prefer it if your baby crawls before they walk. Some babies kind of like just skip that step, but it's supposed to help them, right, with that whole clumsiness and their ability, like spatial awareness. And so just if you have crawlers, let them crawl a little bit, encourage that. Now, for the most part, especially towards the end of the year, they should be able to like pull to stand. if they're not fully walking on their own. And if they're walking, they might be a little shaky, but those are things, right, in terms of their physical development that they should be able to like do. And so, you know, when they're walking, like I said, they'll be a little unstable, totally fine. And again, you'll see a lot more like independent kind of behavior. So like baby safety monitoring, really big thing, right? Sometimes we don't know when all of a sudden they're like up, and you know, if you're not holding on or you don't have something that's secure and they pull on it, they can like fall. So other things to keep in mind, right, when we're looking at milestones. Intellectual development. Now they're imitating sounds. They're watching your mouth move, right, while you're talking. And that's really important because that's going to help with speech, right, development as well. So a lot of these are like really like interconnected. They're also kind of, again, right, repeating actions and different things. They start to learn about like object permanence, like towards the end of that 12th month into the 18th month, right, which means like peekaboo becomes a really amazing, right, like the most fantastic game ever, because you're there and then literally to them like you disappear, right, and then you're back in the picture. And so becomes less fun when they realize that you're still there even after you cover your face, right? Then you know that your baby's past that period. And then again, right, they're using different just like responses and stuff to solve problems, achieve goals, right? This is where like I'm acting upon my environment, if you will. So I'm going to see like, if I hit this, right, it's going to make a sound. So we're looking at a lot of those kinds of like reactions. Now, sometimes babies are advanced, right? And that's okay. But also being mindful to not let, like say, one thing incur, like kind of build your expectations, right? Or like form your expectations like moving forward. So I'll give you an example. My daughter at about 6-7 months was able to do like those 3-piece like wooden puzzles, right? With like those knobs. But then she also developed echolalia when she was 12 and kind of stopped talking. And so we have these big peaks and valleys at times. And so kind of just being mindful, right, that we're not setting these unrealistic expectations one way or the other, depending on, right, some of these different areas that you see developing and coming on board at the right time, or either delayed or a little bit advanced. Good. All right. Language development. This is really key. This is, I think, one of those iffy periods for a lot of people. So we continue right up from like 0 months with increased vocalizations. So you should, here's the thing. I always worry if somebody says to me, oh yeah, I have a baby, but they're so quiet. And they're in that 1 month range. You should know that a baby is in the room. Unless they're napping, it should be pretty evident that a baby is in the room, right? Because they're babbling, they're cooing, they're doing something, right? When they are like too quiet or like too good, if you will, that can actually be a flag for concern. So just something to kind of keep in mind. We do have some kids, you know, the marker that I give or I tend to give regularly is if your child is 1, and this again, right, you have a very little wiggle room, but again, very little wiggle room. By the time they're 5, they should have 5. By the time they're 1, they should have about 5 words that a stranger can understand, right? So if it's the first time that I'm meeting your child and they're calling you and you say, oh yes, my baby says mama, and I don't get mama from what they're saying, right? That I wouldn't count that as a word. Right. And so when we're being mindful, right, and somebody, a professor, like a professional or somebody's asking us, like, how many words does your child have? That should be your standard. It's like, okay, well, does anybody understand them? And just so you get a general idea, right, by the age of 2, more or less, they should have somewhere in like the 200s, right, of like words at least, speaking in 2-word phrases, and at least 50% of everything they say should be understandable by other people. That's a huge jump, right? From like 1 to 2, but just to kind of give you an idea of where we need to kind of be with there. They should understand simple instructions, even by 1. So if you say no, they should understand no, right? Like some simple gestures, right? Like if you wave hi, if you call their name, that's actually one of the flags that we look for, is that they respond, right? Or they orient to their name. right? And especially if you know that they can hear you and they're not just kind of like tuning you out. So those are some things to kind of also keep in mind. With social emotional development, they become particularly attached, right? This is where loveys and stuff come in. Shortly thereafter, right, we're going to see the separation anxiety. And so that's why, you know, they have like these kind of like attachment figures, which is totally fine, healthy. They express frustration when they can't master something. And this is not your terrible twos or tyrannical threes here. This is just babies trying to figure things out. They love attention. And so again, something to kind of keep in mind where we're kind of looking at later development, right? Like this is kind of already starting. They like it when people come, right? And like, oh, and they're kind of talking to them and they're making these silly faces and, you know, they're engaging with them. That's part of typical development for most babies. Sometimes babies can get overwhelmed. That's a different story. So if they're looking at you because you're too in their face and stuff like that, that's also healthy for them to like have a way to like escape that type of situation. Right. And yes, on occasion you might see the tantrums, which are very different than they're crying because they have a need that needs to be met. Um, but yes, they can happen as early as one. All right. Questions, comments, anything before we get into the red flags? I know I threw a lot.
Hi. Oh, hi. My name is Olivia, and I do have a question about what is echolalia?
Oh, echolalia is like parroting kind of speech. And so you see that a lot with kids that have autism or that develop autism. So I'll give you an example. My daughter was speaking fine, and so she knew I was mommy. And then one day I came home and I said, "Hi, Dahlia." And she said, "Hi, Dahlia," instead of saying, "Hi, mommy." Right. So
Oh,
they start to copy what you say. And so it's not functional, even though, and sometimes, and they can copy and imitate like pretty long words or phrases, but they don't really know what it means and they can't use it, right, like appropriately to request or do those types of things. So if you kind of start to notice that, and that's different than mimicking, right? When they're mimicking, they're kind of going along with what you're saying and you're like, mama, and you're kind of doing those sounds and they kind of start copying you. That's totally okay. Echolalia is more like out of the blue, like you say something to them and they say the exact same thing back to you.
and that sort of happened, you said spontaneously?
That happened, yeah. That started to happen spontaneously. Like I said, literally from one day, like because like I said, both of my kids are on the spectrum, their paths were a little bit different in terms of how they're diagnosed. But that is something that we see sometimes regression, where they're completely developing fine, and then all of a sudden they kind of like hit a wall, it seems like. And so for her, it literally was after that, like now we were a lot of her speech was right, like echolalia. And I mean, she was young, she was like in 12, 13 months, and that's kind of when we got her intervention.
Oh, okay. Thank you. I'm not sure. I know there's one more question. I'm so sorry if you have the time.
Yeah, absolutely. Go ahead.
Okay, great. So you said that at 1 years old, they should have 5 words that other people understand apart from their parents. Um, when does that language start to develop? Because I have a 10-month-old and his receptive language is, pretty normal. Like, he understands when we give commands, the no and all that stuff, but he doesn't have any like real, like understandable speech at all. He says mama and dada, but I mean, apart from that, like he doesn't say words. So I'm just wondering, when do those start to happen? Could it happen like at 11 months and all of a sudden? Or my concern is that because we're raising him in a bilingual household, maybe he's like getting confused and it's just too much for him.
No, so the whole and I know this because I worked with a lot of researchers at Children's Hospital that were doing a lot of studies in terms of bilingual babies, just to kind of debunk that myth about it, you know, the code switching is too much. Kind of like I said, sometimes, right, in expressive speech, you might see a little bit of a delay, but if he's making sounds and stuff in general, the reason why sometimes when you do like one language, like it prunes out all of these other sounds that basically it's like you're not going to use this anymore, right? So like you don't need it. Once that pruning kind of stops, then you know, like they're pretty strong in whatever language like or languages that they're learning, right? And they come on board
Mhm.
like at the same time. So, you
Mhm.
know, I'd be more concerned if there's a receptive kind of like delay, because usually in a profile for and I said usually, right? Not always, and a profile for like a baby or a child who's on the spectrum. you'll have a higher expressive language than receptive. So they are able to say a lot more than they can. So right now
Oh.
you're still, like I said, right in that range. So I wouldn't worry too much if he's like making different vocalizations, right? So if there's some like effort to communicate, that's pretty good, especially if he has the mama data. Those are like, you know, some of precursors for a lot of different things, right? More primal sounds like bilabial and all that stuff. Yeah, if that then doesn't progress, you know, I would still give it a little bit, but I would probably talk to your doctor after one if you're not
Mhm.
seeing like intelligible speech kind of like coming on board.
Okay, great. Thank you so much.
No problem. All righty. So thank you for that. Hopefully that also like addresses other people's like questions about that if they had them. So now we're going to talk about red flags that we might be seeing. Okay. And so again, I don't want anybody to like panic, and there's always something that can be done if you are kind of noticing some of these delays or you're not kind of noticing this in like in your children. Okay. So in the birth to 3 month range, right? If they're not kind of like orienting to like loud sounds, right? This can be more an issue of hearing. And so you definitely want to bring that up to your doctors. And as you can see, right, in terms of the way that the frame shows, there's developmental red flags and then there's common challenges. So common challenges you'll see more regularly in more, you know, in more children than not, where the developmental flags are things that you want to communicate to like your doctor. Right, same thing if they're not like following objects with their eyes, right? That can be an indication of something else that's kind of like going on. And so you just want to like ask. A lot of times they'll tell you, oh, it's nothing to worry about, or we'll check, we'll double check hearing, right? Any extra assessments or screeners never hurt. When they're not smiling at the sound of your voice, right? Like 2 months, or they're not cooing, right? They're completely silent. This is what I mean about the quiet babies, right? You definitely want to kind of like bring that up. Again, it's not necessarily an indication that they're not going to, you know, speak or anything like that, but you just want to make sure that at your baby visit, you know, you kind of say like, oh, you know, I've noticed that there's like really no cooing. There's not a lot of sounds that are kind of being produced, so that they can at least kind of like start to scream or like monitor. Good. Grasp and hold, right? Like, so there was a ton of little baby experiments that were done, right? Where they say that a baby's like reflexes to like hold things, right? Like is really like strong. And so noticing for these things, right? Because when we're talking about reflexes, especially at such an early age, right? That can be an indication of something maybe like physical. Sometimes some babies are born with like low muscle tone or things like that. And so all of those are things, right? That talking to the doctor, maybe a little, you know, physical therapy or something like that wouldn't hurt. All right. But again, not necessarily like sound the alarm. It's just, okay, I should follow up. I should check in. Makes sense. Can't support their head, right? And again, if you look at these, a lot of these have more to do with like physical, right? Like their physical abilities, like gross motor, especially. And so, right, the pushing down on the legs, right? And so again, I always say like, bring them up to a doctor, because if it's something that is more physically related, you know, then physical therapy can be something that can do wonders, right? Early on. Good. Yes. Okay. So other common challenges that we might see, right, are the colicky babies. They're waking up at night a lot. Some will have a lot of difficulty with feeding, you know, like if you're nursing, some have a hard time with latching. We tend to see more issues or more like more of these kind of difficulties with babies that are preemies. And so also kind of keeping in mind, right, that you have to correct for the baby's age. And so again, all of these things, especially, right, like the windows where there's some physical stuff, right? Don't hesitate to ask the doctor. And they might say like, oh no, totally fine. We're still within that range. But you know, you just kind of, it never hurts to like communicate that or express that. Good. Now between 4 and 7 months. Okay, so your baby is enrolling over, right, in either direction. And that can be of concern because again, it can be like indicative of like just physical like strength or ability, right? Like their ability to kind of like lift themselves up enough to like turn. And so those are those types of things. They cannot sit without help. You know, they don't laugh necessarily by making like squealing sounds. So a good way to kind of remember, it's like, I think it's at 2 months, they coo, right? And then like, I think it's like at 4 months, they're like supposed to like be able to like laugh. So ha ha, and so these little indicators of things that the babies might be able to do or should be doing. And if you want, I can send you, it's like a little snapshot of like just things that you can look at in terms of like sounds or like where they're supposed to be able to like turn in terms of like their gross motor development. And that's fine. If babies are not kind of reaching, at this time, because this is when we kind of see also like crawling might kind of jump on board. And so, right, we want to make sure that they have the physical ability to kind of like do these things. No babbling by 7 months. Definitely talk to your doctor about it. They definitely might need speech, just depending on when, or they might give you exercises or right, like just different strategies to kind of use to see if it amps up, their verbalization. They'll definitely usually at this point, like check for hearing. You might need to see like a speech pathologist to kind of like rule out any kind of like more physical production type of issue when it comes to like sounds and vocalizations. But with anything, the sooner you're intervening, the better. So yes, super quiet babies. I always say, mention that to the doctor. And don't say like, oh yeah, like they're just, kind of sit and they observe. It's like, no, they don't really make sounds. Because that can be a flag. Like my son, for example, he actually didn't talk until he was 3, almost 3.5. And I knew that there was going to be he at least had a speech delay. He was very observant and, was like tracking and doing these different things. But he had to have been the quietest baby ever. And he was up and alert for a long time and stuff. And so that was, like, okay, there's something, but he didn't babble. I mean, like if I heard him cry every now and then, it was like so surprising for us, but he was way too quiet. And surely enough, right? By the time he was 1, still nothing, had him assessed. And yeah, his first word wasn't until he was like 3.5. And it was cheese. That was his first word, right? Which is a pretty complicated like word if you think about it, but that was his first word. And after that, it was like he just took off and was reading by the, and so you just never know how things will develop and progress. But the earlier on that you intervene, the better it is. Right. And then for you, sometimes, yeah, they say ignorance is bliss, but knowing like what's happening, right? At least knowing that you checked in or that you did something sometimes is comforting in and of itself. Yes. Okay. Susie, did you raise your hand? Oh, let's pick, yeah. Okay. So the crawling stuff, right? We know for a fact that that is an issue. Again, anything that has to do with, physical motor stuff, right, is really important. The single words, right, this is what we're talking about. Make sure again that you're having that. The last part, the not pointing to things, right, that's called joint attention. So babies don't need to have language, right? They'll look at you, right? So let's say they're holding something, right? Oftentimes they might come to you and like kind of like look, right? And so they're sharing their world with you. A child who's potentially like on the spectrum doesn't do that. Right? They kind of keep things to themselves. If anything, they might get upset if you approach them. And so that is a really big thing, right? So even if a child doesn't have like a lot of words, right? Like whatever, like if they have a plane, if they have the toy, usually it's their inclination to want to share, right, their world with you. And so if that's not happening, make sure, right? Also separation anxiety, we see it. If you have a baby and you leave the room and they know that you leave the room and they have absolutely no response, that can be a flag. Well, actually, that is a flag that you should kind of pay attention to, right? Like a baby recognizes when their caregivers are gone and usually has some kind of emotional reaction. So around 9 months, again, 9 to 12 months, you have that reemergence like separation anxiety. Good? Yes? All righty. Are we ready to move on to our toddlers? Yes? Okay. So gross motor, right? A lot of these things, I won't read every single one because you have that right, but I lost you. Okay. So by this time, right, they should be solid enough to like walk along, right? So they shouldn't be shaky again, right? And if they are, be careful with that. They can walk backwards, right? They can squat to pick things up from the floor. They can pull and push like toys. Yeah, and then, right, depending on how advanced they are, they should be able to manage to get themselves up and down like stairs, right? Either like kind of bending their knees, right, and crawling up, depending on how cautious they are, or like, a lot of kids are pretty brave and they like hold on to like stones or like, like, or handrails or like their parents' hands. And so those are things that you see, right? For cognitive developmental stuff, right? They start to recognize, right, the difference between you and me. And so this is where they shouldn't be mouthing things as much anymore, right? Because that happens in the first year where it's very exploratory. Again, now you're seeing more of this whole, they're interacting with their environment, right? They might be approaching like some people, so they see themselves like in the mirror, right? Going into social development stuff. They are not going to be necessarily playing with other peers, but they do engage in something that we call parallel play, right? Which is they play right next to each other. So they have the same toy or different toy or whatever, right? And they're totally happy playing next to each other. Yes. And they have some pretend play that they can engage in, right? Where like they can pick up something and be like, oh, pretend that it's a phone when it really is like a hairbrush or something along those lines. Those are like typical. Fine motor, right? They can turn knobs. Again, like they're gesturing. I think there's like, I don't know if it's 2 or 3 blocks that they might be able to kind of like stack together. Definitely you see the emergence of like the pincer grasp should be on point by that time. And they like the way that they hold a pencil, right? Like shouldn't be like doing like a palmer's grasp. Okay, so those are things that you want to look out for. Language development. Okay. They understand simple directions, and this could be like up to 2-word instructions, right? Like come here, like another example. I don't know, another example like a 2-3-word instruction. I'm blanking. Or like put toys down or something along like, but very like something simple, right? Like bring me your bag or like put that down, stuff like that. Their vocabulary has expanded. So here you can see it's anywhere between 200, that's up to say 400 words. And then you need to see phrases by 2 years, right? It doesn't have to be like whole sentences, but they should have at least 2 to 3 word phrases by the 2-year mark. Okay, and now we're starting to understand like questions, right? And they can kind of use it also. Some kids are more better with like syntax, and so grammatically correct can come on board, right? And then like this is where singing songs and like all of those rhyming kinds of things really comes into play, because these skills are kind of like coming on board at that time when it comes to their language. And the earlier you introduce it to them, right, because they're also better able to like mimic and imitate, right, they stick more. And so all of those things are like really helpful. But yeah, you should see a lot more language, right? 2 to 3 word phrases by the time that they're 2. They should be pretty solid when they're moving around. If they're really shaky, again, right, cause for concern. Differentiating between like me, you, right, like because up until then it's like you and the caregiver or the child and the caregiver are like one, right? Which is sometimes it becomes really difficult for kids, and especially when they're kind of trying to individuate. And then when it comes to interacting with their peers, they want to play next to a child, right? So expecting them to engage in like sharing and stuff like that might be a little too advanced, but those are some of the things that we want to see by age 2. Yes. Okay. So common challenging behaviors, I'll go through the red flags and then we can kind of like elaborate a little bit more on the common behaviors. But you can see, right, does the opposite of what they're being asked to do. Sometimes it's more of a clarification thing. Sometimes they're just kind of testing limits because that's what they're supposed to do. But if you have a child who consistently does not respond, right, to instructions or commands, like there's a potential for different things. Either receptively, they don't really understand what's happening. You can have like, what is it? Oh, great. Pathological like demand avoidance, which is more common in kiddos that are on the spectrum. But they should be able to, at least on occasion, follow an instruction. Yes. Doesn't follow simple instructions, doesn't show understanding of familiar commands, right? Those are kind of related. But yes, it's really important that we kind of pay attention to like how much do they understand, right? That falls into the receptive language piece. They don't always like listen, even if they do understand, right? But it's really important to make sure and try to assess, right? Like, do they understand this? Like, come, if I say come and I don't do a hand signal, like, will they come to where I am at? Right? That is a very simple kind of way to like assess, if you will. Shows no interest in communicating or interacting with others. And so again, like I said, right, by the age of 2, they're doing parallel play. If they have no interest in being spoken to, they just kind of want to be completely on their own, very withdrawn, right? That is not something that's completely typical of a child in that age, right? And so definitely things to kind of screen for, monitor. You have extreme reactions to minor frustrations, right? And then there's impulse control, like difficulties or like just taking things, being really impulsive. Sometimes it can be more of a, I can't regulate right sufficiently, and tantrums, for example, for this age group. Like if you are running into a child who's tantruming for like more than like 15 minutes, and I mean like screaming that like that is a concern, right? Because with support from an adult, they should be able to like regulate, right, within the context of that dyad. Regularly displays like aggressive behavior. Either this could be because of lack of words, it can be because they're trying to avoid or escape something tactile, right? This is where the emergence of sensory stuff comes in. But we see that main form of communication is either aggression, right, or frustration, or isolation, or elopement. Okay. And again, no interest in playing with peers. We kind of looked at this, right? So you'll see a common theme of not responding, right, to language or to like verbal kinds of requests. There's isolation or doesn't show any interest, right, in their peers or typically developing peers. Emotional dysregulation kind of issues also, right, are these flags that we're looking for at this age. Yes, and then down to the bottom, you'll see, right, we talked about them being pretty solid when it comes to walking and getting around. Sometimes kids that do have certain like pervasive developmental disorders do have hypotonia, which is like low muscle tone, and they might have it in different areas. So for example, babies that have those really cute cheeks, right, then you almost see them drooling a little bit, that can be hypotonia in their cheeks, which then produces, right, because all the jaw and all of that's a muscle, that can produce speech delays, right? Because if your muscles aren't strong enough to produce speech, right, you have this situation. So paying attention to those types of things, right? It's not just cute, right? After the age of like 1.5, now it can be, right, like a symptom of something else. Good. Do we need another? All righty. I'm sorry if I'm like going through this all like super fast. Okay. Now for your 2 and your 3-year-old. Anybody shocked by the language development portion where it says that now you're seeing something like in the thousands of words by the age of 3? Yeah. And we're now also using like pronouns, you and me, and you can name things, right? Like this is where you start like community helpers and what do they do? And like these kinds of things come on board. And like I mentioned before, it is understandable to familiar adults. And actually, this is even for unfamiliar adults, at least 50% of the time. So now you have, right, a range of anywhere between 200 and 1,000 words that most people should be able to understand. So keep that in mind, because that is often, and I don't know, you know, it's hard. And having been there with my kids, definitely difficult, especially when it's like a family thing and like there's a history, right? And now you're like, oh, now it's in my kids, and but you understand what it means. And so I just not ignore that, because they will need support in that area. Again, right, for social emotional development, we're talking about being able to like engage now, not just in parallel play, right, where they're next to each other, but like actually interactive play, right? Like where they might be building a tower together and like, oh, it's my turn, and you know, give me this piece. They can show like empathy towards somebody else. So if somebody falls, right, they might go to the friend and you know, and like want to see, you know, what's happening, or they might get mad at a teacher or like a parent if they see them like, you know, like get upset with their friend or show like a scowly face or something like that, right? They're also showing a lot more independence. And this is kind of where you get into that, like, I want to do it, no, and then they can't do it, right? And then they want you to help, and you're just like, I have no idea what my kid wants, right? They're like falling apart. But this is that whole kind of like struggle between like being independent, right? And like dependent still, and still needing help with that. And so all you can do kind of is like, okay, well, I'm here for you if you change your mind, right? We can contain it. But this is kind of some of the stuff that you're going to see. They also start to engage in more elaborate, like complex, like imaginative play. So creativity, if you're seeing it in your kids, wonderful, right? When you're rigid and you can't, for example, and I've had little kids tell me this before, like if I pick up a phone and it's like a brick or something, like, you know, one of those like foam bricks, and I'm like, hello, and they're like, what are you doing? Like, that's ridiculous. You know, like that's not a phone. Okay, I'm sorry. I'll put it down. But again, right, like that inability or like that challenge to not be able to see something for other than it is, right, can also be one of those things that we need to spot, because it's important to be imaginative, to be creative. Motor skills, right? Now we're walking up and down stairs 1 foot at a time, right? You can throw a ball like overhead. You know, you're pretty solid, you know, like the whole tricycle stuff. And you have some kids that are way more advanced. But if you think about it, like now, like you can start to like copy a circle, you know, I think squares are still, they might be able to do a cross. That might be more in the 4 range, but a square comes on a little later. But they're already like able to manipulate a pencil, right? And have the fine motor ability and dexterity to actually like hold it, right? Make it clear, write it so that somebody can see it and it's legible enough, right? Sensory processing. So this is a new kind of area that we didn't talk about in terms of development, but this can actually hit in a lot of different ways, right? So this kind of shows the way that sensory input, right, or sensory information is processed like by your child, right, on like their system, their central nervous system. So it can affect, again, a lot of different areas. Sometimes if they're overwhelmed, let's say like if they're sensitive to light or sound, you might see behavioral, right, like kind of responses in your children that you might not see otherwise. And so I think the example that I usually give when my son started like kindergarten is when they were doing like I don't know if they still do it, but like hot meals or whatever in the classroom, and he hates the smell of milk. Like he gags, he will throw, he cannot stand it. And so I'm so glad that I talked to the teacher beforehand, and he said, oh, by the way, he's not a runner, but if like they have cereal or something, you might need to like either put him in a corner, or maybe he can like, you know, right outside the classroom. And he's like, I'm so glad you said that, because we are having cereal in the class, and that would have avoided a big thing, right? But let's say he would have ran out of the class and that wasn't information that a teacher would have had, right? Now that becomes a behavioral issue or disruption. And it's all because of sensory input, right? And sensory overload. So that piece becomes very important, and not just in kids that are on the spectrum, because anybody can have sensory preferences. Behavioral concerns, right? Because like you're showing more independence, right? They tend to be more, you know, more willing to kind of express different emotions. You might see more meltdowns. Actually, you will see more meltdowns. And all behavior is communication. So just like adults have a hard time, right, communicating what they feel, or right, especially if they're like really upset about something, same goes for a child, right? Just much harder. And so when you're trying to like get through to a kiddo in their mid like meltdown, you probably are just going to have to contain, because their ability to kind of put words to whatever that emotion is, right, it's going to be hard. And then you'll see that behavioral kind of component come out, right, where they might throw something because they're trying to like show you, right, if anything, just how upset they are. And it goes in a lot of different directions. Good. Good. Okay. Next slide. Okay. Red flags. All right. So limited vocabulary, right? And so limited, we're talking about less than like 50 words by the age of 2. And yeah, so, you know, age of 1, again, you want to see the babbling and stuff like that. But if there are less than 50 words, your child is even like, I'll even give them some wiggle room, like 3, and they can't really be under, that's going to impact so many different areas of their development and how it manifests and it expresses, right? Especially since at this time, more or less, a lot of them are kind of starting to like start school and stuff like that. Not using simple sentences, right, again, is a huge flag, which means, and it doesn't even necessarily like it's autism or something like that, right? But it definitely is a sign of a speech delay, right? That you should get intervention for. Unintelligible speech. So this is where, right, some kids, they talk gibberish and they're like, you know, and I've had that and I'm just like, I have no idea, right? So you got to think about it this way. If your child is trying to express themselves or communicate in a setting where for whatever reason you're not around, and that's all they have, right, to kind of get their needs met, like, who's going to interpret for them? You know what I mean? So it's almost like if they don't have speech, if they're not able to use it in a way that's going to get them help, that's going to get them fed, if that's what they need, right? And so that's kind of the context under which, right, we talk about unintelligible speech, right, like where that kind of fits in. You know, like same thing with echolalia. Great that you can repeat these long, elaborate words, but if you can't use them, right, for the most basic things, and then they're almost like useless to you, right? And so that's kind of what we hone in terms of like functional communication. Yes. No interest when it comes to social emotional development, right? Again, and we'll have extremes, and there's a lot of misnomers in terms of like absolutely no interest, right, in social interactions, because you also might have kids that are very intrusive. Like they want to play, they just have no idea, right? And so what I encourage you to like start to look at is the quality of the relationship that your kids are having with their peers. Because if they say, oh, I have a friend, right, but usually this friend is the kid that I take stuff away from, or that I force to chase me around even when they don't want to, right? Or vice versa, because that does happen. Then, you know, the quality of the relationship maybe not be the best one, right? And so that also counts, right, for like an impaired social emotional kind of like development. Same thing with pretend play, right? Like lacking that imaginative play, right, really kind of limits them. Because if you think about, right, like some of the like activities or the games that kids play, it's like, oh, well, I'm going to be this, and then you do that, right, and you chase me around. Like, and if they don't have the ability to kind of do that, that's going to limit again their opportunities to engage their peers, to kind of have these learning opportunities. So really key. And then extreme separation anxiety, right? This is where they're like clinging, and so it's really hard, right? And if you think about it, you know, in terms of like these areas or these like red flags, like how they impact the child or the individual, it really like has a ways of isolating them. And when you're isolated, the amount of learning that you can do, right, not just academically, but just experiences, right, and learning about people and how you engage, really cuts them off from like their environment, from their families even. And so, right, this is where it's hard to be able to regulate and know how to, you know, yeah, have like just positive, like emotional growth if you don't have opportunities to kind of do it. Right. So these are why we really focus hard on this stuff. Cognitive development, right? Again, no interest in stories or like pictures. It's hard for them to recognize like common objects or like tasks, for example, that you accomplish, like maybe fitting things into like a cube or something like that, you know, like those boxes with the shapes. They're not able to do that by this age, right? Kids should have the dexterity to like move things around. And so that's really, those are things that you're like, okay, if maybe they knew that before and all of a sudden they can't do that, or their frustration tolerance, right, is just like completely shot. And so there's different reasons, right, or different yeah, things that kind of contribute to these like delays, if you will, or these flags. And so being able to kind of look through all of them and to see where it is that it's impacting the child. Motor skills, right? Fine motor tasks. Some of these things also, like even though they're little, can kind of start to hit their self-esteem, right? Like not being able to draw or write. Sometimes, you know, when we come to like sensory OT kinds of things, it's maybe they're not putting enough pressure on the pencil. Maybe they do have like this palmer's grasp, right? And they have to learn how to hold things correctly. Playing up, this is really big, the frequent falls and like the poor balance, right? That can be like if you have a kid who's on like an apparatus and their balance, right, like is off, that those are a lot of like safety concerns, you know, because all it takes is for like a slight topple. Like, I mean, I tell Susie this all the time. Like, my kid has like OT stuff because he literally falls out of the chair just sitting down, and he's 12.
You
How that?
guys, my son is in his second week of school and he's been to the nurse's office 4 times already. I think they already know exactly who he is, and I'm sure they're going to get to know him very, very well, because this is like literally a daily occurrence at our house as well. Most definitely.
Right. And then for sensory processing, right, or like even motor skills, just the combination of how these skills, right, and the sensitivity kind of come into play, right? Like, I'll give you an example. My daughter has like, she's very sensitive to sound. So sometimes she has to wear those like soundproof kind of like headphones, even in the class, because regular sound is a lot. They had like a alarm of some sort. And the first week, like she bolted, right? Because it was just like, and she fell, and kids are coming out of the classroom. And luckily she had a one-on-one. But these are the types of things, right, that accumulative kind of issues, right, can create, and you need to make sure that you're aware of like, okay, we have concerns about these different areas, because again, right, like the way they kind of combine can be, it can create a very scary situation for the child, for you, for everybody involved. Yes, sensory processing. So this is where we kind of start to see some repetitive behaviors, right? And sometimes this can be like the hand flapping, right? And so we call this like stimming. And there's a lot of different ways to stim. Not all stimming is like hand stimming or like hand flapping. You have kids that like to spin, and the way that you know that they're stimming is pay attention to their eyes. If they're like up like to the corner, right, on either side, and they're spinning, they're getting a lot of sensory input when they're doing that, versus like a kid who's just twirling and then like falls because they're so dizzy. All right, like they can spin and spin and spin because, again, right, like their body is seeking this input. And so it can look a lot of different ways. I have kids that do verbal stimming, for example. Sometimes that can be humming because they like the way the reverberation feels like on their throat. And so they'll hum a certain kind of way to get that sensation. And the thing with stimming behaviors is that they're automatically reinforced. So for anybody here who likes to crack their knuckles, right, you don't need me to go, oh, that was the best, that was the loudest, good job cracking your knuckles, right? You're going to do it whether I tell you that or not, because it feels good when you do it. And that's kind of what happens, right, when kids stim or have these kind of automatically reinforced responses. You can also use those, right, or that information to like regulate your child, right? Because sometimes sensory kind of processing like issues can look a lot like ADHD, but they're not necessarily hyperactive. They're just seeking a certain kind of input, right? And we can kind of touch on that in a little bit. But the same thing with like kids that don't want to walk on grass, right? Or they don't want to like be barefoot, or they don't like the touch of like sand, or if you put like shaving cream or things that you think other kids like flip for, they're like, oh my God. And they're like, no, I don't. And like they'll cry and they'll have this extremely dysregulating response to that. You have your sensory kind of avoidant type of child, right? And then in terms of behavioral concerns, this is where learning and planning and right more intentional kinds of things happen. So for example, you see persistent aggression, right? They're regularly hitting or pushing and we don't really know what the source of that is. If you give a child consequences, sufficiently, and you're still not seeing a change in the behavior, we really have to explore like what is happening to set that kid up, and do we need to teach in a more intentional kind of way, right? In terms of like what is happening immediately before this behavior occurs, right? And what is it that we need to do to kind of flip that consequence? Because apparently, when you see a persistent behavior, their need is being met somehow. We got to figure out how to like change that. Right? Severe prolonged tantrums, right? These are frequent, these are intense. Remember, we talked about like the inability to regulate emotionally. Now, I will say this. Kids kind of lack the capacity to regulate without like an adult up until the age of 3. It's not impossible, but right, working up until the age of 3, usually they can be comforted by, like a familiar adult or a caregiver, right? Like at school, even a friend. So they're doing it in the context of a relationship. Now, if you have a child who doesn't matter how many people are there and they're just cannot for the life of them regulate, right? That is definitely something. It can either be, a lot of anxiety. We don't know what the root cause is, but we know that by that time you shouldn't see such prolonged, right, or intense kind of like tantrums anymore. And then the lack of interest in playing, right? And I'm talking about playing like kind of traditional playing, like sometimes kids will, and this is kind of a clear sign of a child who potentially is on the spectrum, or actually very likely on the spectrum, is instead of playing with toys, like kind of like a toy car and going like, vroom, like most kids will do, right? They'll line things up, or they'll flip them over and all they want to do is see how the wheels turn, right? Or they take something that isn't really a toy and they're like just fascinated by the movement of it, right? Or the way a part kind of goes. So it's not so much the playing, right? It's more about like, oh, I have these two things, and instead of building blocks, I just want to hear them crash. Like that's it, right? And so play looks very differently. And they can do that for hours, right? And so these are definitely things that we want to make a note of, intervene as soon as possible. The other thing, and I think you might mention this really quickly, is before the age of 3, and at any point really, but the brain grows the most, right, and develops the most between the ages of like birth and 3, right? And so if you have a concern about your child, and don't wait. Like no harm will come to your child if you ask a question, or if you say like, oh, I'm thinking I need to like follow up or get an assessment or something. That's not going to harm you, right? If anything, it will facilitate, right? Treatment. It'll probably, the prognosis is way better when you intervene right before the age of 3. And it actually does set them up for success, right? Because the brain is so just, there's so much plasticity, right? And so much more malleable at that time that your odds of success, right, like just go up exponentially, like if you're able to kind of intervene in that time frame. Okay, it's not impossible after the fact, but the earlier the better. Yes. Okay. Susie, I don't know if, because most of the kiddos were in the 2 to 3 age, if you want to take a couple of questions, or do we want to just kind of move?
Yeah, we can do that. If you guys have a couple of questions you'd like to ask now, we can open it up for a minute or two. Or if you'd like to put it in the chat, if you don't feel comfortable asking the question out loud, please go ahead and do so, and we can address those. And if not, we can keep going. Because yeah, it was a majority of them that were in that age. One thing that I do want to kind of reinforce and just kind of like really drive the point home is, as far as like behavioral wise, you touched upon, aggression and like biting and hitting and, tantrums. And we know that a lot of this behavior, for it could be typical, right? I've had a couple of parents that I've spoken to, and Jess, you can jump in and chime in and correct me if I'm wrong, but it's not necessarily what they're doing. Sometimes it's maybe like the degree to which it's being done, the severity at which it's being done, the length of time that it's like the duration. So, a lot of times people will be like, oh, well, 2-year-olds bite. Yeah, they bite, but they don't bite 5 times a day by 10:30 a.m. like my son was at, 3 years old. That's not normal. So that's kind of the kind of things that we want to look out for, is just like that fine balance between what is, typical challenging behavior for a particular age, and when it kind of crosses over into something that we should really kind of take a look at. Yes, can we touch on the impact of mobile and digital devices on a child's development? If you
Well,
have
here's
any.
I mean, just like the APA and like all these different groups kind of warn against extended, right, like just screen time or whatever. Now, if you can find a way to make it interactive, and like kind of learning based, I think there can be some benefits to something like that. If you have a child who's typically like underly like kind of like stimulated and just is not really showing a lot of interest, sometimes you can utilize that, right? But again, it's always like limiting the amount of time, like a screen. And I'm not saying that anybody does this, but like a screen, and it's just kind of them having them, like, I'm surprised at how many like 2-year-olds can operate like iPads and go through all of these different things. And I'm just like, wow, that's skill, but they're having difficulties in a lot of other areas, because they're, the way that, a child's brain develops, especially in those first 3 years, has so much to do with the interactions that they have, with other people. And so, I'm not going to be a hypocrite and say, oh no, never screens. No, they can serve a purpose, but I think, what we tend to find most is that when kids are on their devices, or, it's, they're just there with nobody kind of monitoring what is happening. And so if you sit with your child and you can make that an interactive experience, right? Like, it shouldn't be like harmful. Just keep in mind, right, that like just programs and things are kind of designed to kind of like hit your brain with like doses of like dopamine, right? And it's very kind of calculated in the way that it's distributed. And so that is one of the things, the reasons why, the colors and all of that, right, really engage somebody, because it's designed to kind of grab your brain, right, and give it all this input. And so when you kind of try to introduce something that's less, right, exciting, and like not as many flashing lights and all of that, they may not be as engaged. But if you can make it so that it's something interactive and you do limit the use, right, if there are worse things. But yes, I wouldn't recommend it like to leave a child like unsupervised, like doing it, because yeah, that's kind of how they get lost in that world, and then becomes an expectation, right? Like, you'd be surprised how many parents I have that they have 3-year-olds and 4-year-olds, and they're like, I can't get them to like not give me the device, and they have like these crazy tantrums over it, and then it becomes problematic. Okay, hopefully that answers that.
Awesome. For the sake of time, Jess, could we just pick a couple of items that are on this particular list to highlight, and then in the next slide for the red flags, we can focus on, like the stuff that we should be looking out for?
Sure. So with this, right, the gross motor and stuff, again, right, we're talking about balancing and all of that. So I don't want to go through too much of that. But yes, like scissors, cutting, stuff like that, right? They should be able to do, at least with support. Communication, again, right? Like, they should be talking in phrases, if they're not doing that, make sure you get them assessed. That's always like really key. And they can also follow like multiple step kind of directions or commands. In terms of their cognitive development, right? Like, now you should be able to ask questions, right? And like those like what, where, when kind of thing. Why is usually the one that we kind of leave a little bit later, but other kinds of like W, whatever questions, like we should be able to like ask. And just in terms of like their awareness of time, right? Not necessarily that they can tell time, but just their awareness of like, oh, yesterday was kind of the past, right? Tomorrow or the weekend, right? That's the future. They should also be able to kind of like distinguish between those things. So when we have kids that are mixing things up, we don't really know, right, what's happening. Social emotional development, again, right? Sharing and taking turns, I'm not going to overly pathologize that, because this is an area that kids struggle with, specifically in the 2 and 3-year range, right? If you're still seeing that like pretty consistently in this age range, that's problematic, right? Because by this time, they should be able to share something, right? Maybe not their favorite things, but they should be able to share a couple of things, right? They should also be able to seek help or support, right? Like, if they're distressed, maybe like seek a comforting or familiar adult. And so again, if you have somebody who is just, isolating, not wanting to, or just very intrusive and is kind of like all over the place, right? Hard time emotionally regulating, then those are the things that we want to kind of pay attention to. Okay, but aside from like, every now and then having like a blurb, like this age group, you shouldn't be getting calls regularly, right? That they're tantruming, that they're throwing things, that they're being aggressive. Right.
Yes, we have one question on 2.5-year-olds. Are 5-minute timeouts appropriate for a 2.5-year-old? We usually will talk after to let them know what would be the desired behavior versus what they did and what kind of impact they had.
That conversation might be a little much for or too complex for that age range. Usually when we teach timeouts, we start off in that 2, 3, 8 range so that they kind of understand. We don't want to give them, right, the idea that it's like a punishment. 5.5 minutes can seem a little long for them, just because time, right? They're not fully there. And so when we do it with older kids, it should be like 1 minute, like per age, like their age, right? And so it probably should be like 2 minutes. And then the conversation should kind of happen leading like beforehand. Because it's kind of like you pay a fine, right? And you already pay your ticket, and then you have to go to like traffic school in addition to paying. So you're like, well, why did I pay the fine, right? Like if I'm still gonna kind of get the punishment type of thing. And so right after they've completed their timeout, if they do it, it's like, oh, great job. Let's kind of like reintegrate you, right? Like you were able to sit calmly and time out, reward that, and then give them an opportunity so that you can like praise them for something positive, right? And reintegrate them so that they don't like feel like, oh, why was I kind of like put in timeout or something. And generally speaking, you'll have a much easier time with timeouts if you teach it like to them as the way to kind of calm down, right? To like take some deep breaths, to feel better because their bodies are kind of like maybe too wiggly.
Perfect. Thank you.
Okay. And so I kind of addressed some of these, right, when I was talking about like what we want to see in the development. But again, right, persistent clumsiness, we're talking about just delays, any kind of gross motor movement or yeah, fine motor movement, these are areas where we can start to look for occupational therapy, because they're going to need some support, right, in order to like catch up. Again, severe tantrums, we don't really see it too much in this age range. The emotional dysregulation, right, it's like a big thing. Also, the awareness, so self-awareness starts to kind of come on board, like around this age, and tidbits, but they should be able to say like, oh yeah, this happened, and I feel a certain way if they have language. And if they're just kind of like, whatever, like I have no idea why, that's kind of it. And it almost looks, and I'm not saying that it's not remorseful, but they have a really hard time making that connection, right? Those are areas of concern. Extreme anxiety, right? If they can't separate from you, or if they don't care if you're there or not, right? Any of those extremes are also things that we want to pay attention to. And remember, anytime you see lining up of toys or sequencing or play that doesn't look like play, that it's more like mechanics kind of a thing, right? Those are big flags. Good. Anything else? I think I hit the big ones. Okay. So not sure how many of you have, but again, as you can see, like it's repetitive and it just kind of like builds, right? And so if you're seeing in your child, right, something that you find like say a tantrum, or right in a 5-year-old that's more consistent of a 2 or a 3-year-old, right, then that should always kind of be a marker. Because remember, those milestones are met, right? They're there. And if they're either not progressing or they stop, or you're still seeing a lot of those behaviors, especially, right, if their behavior is communication, but if they're not using their words, or they're having a really hard time being able to use language to kind of communicate what their needs are. And because of that, right, you're seeing a lot more behavioral kind of like difficulties or aggression, right? Same thing with frustration, because I'm not able to kind of explain, or even if I have words, I just can't use them in these particular situations. Those are all kind of causes for concern. Right. And you will see this. Some kids do have the language. Some kids do, right, are like super bright and they're still having difficulties, right, when it comes to making friends, or they're like super anxious, or they can't tolerate, right, either because of a sensory issue or some other, right, component. So I also will always look at, okay, if I have a child who for the most part kind of meets a lot of their milestones and is still having a really difficult time either with making friends at this age, right, or with emotional regulation, I would like ask for assistance. Okay. Any questions and stuff? Okay, so same stuff that we just kind of repeated, right? Yeah, basically the same lines of stuff, right? Lack of imagination, all of those things. And again, you'll have like all of these. Now, we're not saying that a kid should never cry, never like demonstrate their emotions. That's not healthy. We want them to be able to show and to communicate, right? But we're talking again about just extremes, right? And so, yeah, maybe if something really big happens, like if you think about it, a 5-minute tantrum is still a long tantrum, right? It's still a long time to kind of be emotionally like really dysregulated. So if you have a child who's like in their 4 or 5s and they're still having tantrums that are longer than that, that's a flag, right? And it's not just always autism. There's a lot of different things that can be happening, right? So being mindful of that we're not just talking about autism or even necessarily only developmental delays, but we start seeing the presence of a lot of different things, right, kind of surface also around this age. Anybody else? Okay, so concerns. What do we do? You can always find Susie on campus. No, I'm just saying. You can definitely always like contact us, right? But, and this is the biggest thing, right? Like I said, the walk away is if you have a concern of any sort, right? The system, the way that it is designed is for you to basically get the most support before your child turns 3, right? This is where you can contact the regional center and they will assess your child to see if there are any delays. Best worst case, you know, if you will, it's like they say, no, everything is fine. They're meeting developmental milestones, right? You don't need any services. Good. You don't have to worry about that, right? On a different scenario, what if they say, actually, we are seeing a delay and we want to give you these services and they're free, right? It's a win-win. I've yet to see a child harmed by any early intervention. Basically, they're paying somebody to come and interact with your child and developmentally like stimulate them so that, you know, like, so they're up to par with like their typically developing peers if there is, right, a challenge. And so early intervention is ideal for you that have like those 2-year-olds, right? If you have concerns and you need to contact the regional center, do it now, because by the time your kid is like, even as early as 2.5, they'll start kind of referring you to like the IEP process, which is not bad. So if you don't plan on having your child in special, like in private school, right? And like after like TK or whatever, your plan is to transition them anyway to public school, they'll kind of start the process for you. Again, doesn't hurt. They'll assess for different areas, right? And determine what supports they might need, right? But early intervention is key and it's free. And it's easier to get.
Would you mind just briefly touching on what the regional center is and why that responsibility of you know, taking care of those needs for children transfers over to the IEP process, so that would now fall into the hands of the public school district, let's say?
So there's federal law, right, in terms of special education. It's called IDEA. And so basically it makes different entities responsible, right, like the systems of care, if you will, for providing services for, you know, individuals that have special needs. So the regional center is tasked with providing early intervention services between the ages of 0 to 3, right? And that's for anybody. After the age of 3, right, you have to have a qualifying diagnosis, which is like a pervasive kind of developmental disorder, whether it be like Down syndrome, autism, right, seizure, epilepsies, that kind of stuff. After, let's say your child doesn't qualify for one of those diagnoses, right, now the task goes to the districts, the school districts, right? They are responsible for assessing your child, right, for potential areas of disability, and they have to provide, if needed, an individualized educational plan, which is what an IEP is, right, to ensure that your child is successful, right, or is able to access the general curriculum in the school setting, in a public setting, because the way that our, you know, we're set up in terms of like educational rights is every child has a right to a free and appropriate public education. And if a right program isn't available to your child given their needs, right, the district has to kind of get creative. And so, you know, that's kind of the way that it falls. So everybody's kind of tasked with their own things. Now, after their child turns 18 or they graduate from high school, the responsibility goes back to the regional center in terms of services that they provide, right? Assuming that they have a qualifying diagnosis. But this is what I'm saying, like early intervention is key because you don't have to have a diagnosis of like autism or anything like that. They are responsible for providing that to like anybody who qualifies, like just basically,
For
which is
free, you guys. This is a nonprofit entity that works for the state of California, and they have regional centers all across the state. And this is specifically what they are dedicated to doing. So the earlier, the better. One thing that I do want to say is even though there are additional criteria after the age of 3, that you need to meet, specifically a diagnosis to qualify, they will assess your child to see if a diagnosis is needed, and they will do it for free. This is how we were able to obtain a diagnosis for my son. And not that I was looking for one, but I was just looking for answers. And you're talking to someone who had 3 assessments. And every single time I was told that nothing was going on, and just my gut kept telling me something was up, right? Nothing's wrong with my son. My son's different. But something kept telling me that something was up. And sure enough, the regional center, right after Kaiser, told me everything was all good, because I was able to convince them to come out to the school, which was the setting where my son was exhibiting the majority of his behaviors, because obviously at school they have a lot more demands. You know, they have friends there who aren't necessarily catering to their needs. So it was a very different child that was observed in that school setting than at my home, or let's say in the office. So they provide that service for free. And if you have any concerns, if you have even like an inkling that, you know, there might be something there, you lose absolutely nothing by requesting an assessment. So I definitely, if there's something that is just really like tugging at your gut, I would say follow through and just rule it out. Rule it out, and then you can move forward and see if there's anything else that needs to be addressed.
Mhm. There's no stigma. And like I said, take advantage of it. So I think one of the only things that they ask you for is like your insurance kind of like benefits, but they don't cover early intervention services because the way the system is. So it's just kind of a formality, you know, and it's a very easy, accessible way of getting, like I said, if your child qualifies, early intervention
Yep.
support for free for your
Yep.
kids.
We can provide information to you guys if you're at any point interested in you know, looking into that. Our brochures are with the admin office. I believe they have them outside on a stand for you guys to take, so you can always reach out to us. Up here on your screen, you're going to see information for the CDC website. They have a really cool milestone tracker that you can download to your phone, and you can be tracking your child's milestones as they're kind of going through their phases as well. And I think, I mean, Jessica, you kind of got ahead of me because I had all the stuff that you just talked about on the next slide, but awesome job. I thank you guys so much for being here with us today. Worst case scenario, you don't remember half of the things that we just told you, shoot us an email. Shoot us an
Mhm.
email, reach out to the school. We are always here to help you guys. We're providing this service for free as a part of our collaboration with the school, and we are more than happy to answer any questions that you may have. If anybody has any other questions, we have about a minute. I want to again reiterate, you know your child best. If something in your gut is telling you something is not right, or you know, you're getting answers that you're not feeling are like, you know, gelling, keep pushing. Don't give up. Trust your instinct, because I would say that 90% of the time you're probably going to be right, because we know our kids better than anybody else.
Mhm.
So
And I'm
thank you
so
guys so
glad
much. Thank you. This is the first of 3 webinars that we're going to have. The next one is going to be on the importance of routines, and maybe helping you guys set up some routines for your children, and just having a discussion on how beneficial that is for your children and for yourselves and your peace of mind. So we will be having that one in September, and I really hope that you guys can join us for that as well. Thank you guys so much.